Welcome to a Dual Digest podcast where two friends dive deep into the topics that matter.
From technology and AI to science, history, and global trends, we break down complex ideas and make them easy to understand.
Whether you're here for insights, entertainment, or just some good conversation, we've got you covered.
Just remember, stay curious, question everything, and keep exploring the world around you. And remember, every great conversation starts with a curious mind. Let's explore together.
Make sure to follow and subscribe.
All right, let's dive in. Today we're tackling something pretty massive, the whole history of humankind.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, big stuff. We'll be using excerpts from Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind by Yuval Noah Harari. It's really packed with these, fascinating insights about how we went from, insignificant creatures to running the whole planet.
Yeah, it's really an incredible journey. I mean, when you think about it, in the grand scheme of things, we've only been around for a tiny, tiny sliver of time.
Exactly. And Harari takes us all the way back to the Big Bang, 13.5 billion years ago, atoms forming, stars igniting, and then finally life appears after, forever.
Yeah.
And this is the crazy part, for most of our time on Earth, we were just another species. No more impactful than, say, a jellyfish.
I know, right? That's honestly one of the things that really struck me about the book. It really makes you question our whole idea of human significance. We tend to think of ourselves as the top of the evolutionary ladder, but for millions of years, we were just another animal trying to survive.
It's humbling, isn't it? So how did Homo sapiens even come to be in the first place?
Well, we evolved, of course, over a very long time. We shared common ancestors with other human species like Neanderthals and Denisovans.
Oh, right.
We walked upright, made tools, had bigger brains than other apes, but we weren't exactly building, skyscrapers or anything like that.
And there's that interesting thing that Harari points out about these early humans. It wasn't always so clear-cut, who was a different species and who wasn't.
That's a really good point. The way I think about it is like this. Every two distinct species, say horses and donkeys, were once just two populations within the same species.
Okay, yeah.
Kind of like, bulldogs and spaniels are today.
Uh-huh.
There might have been a point where Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, distinct groups, for sure, could still interbreed, actually have kids together who could have kids of their own.
That's kind of wild to think about. So at some point, something changed, the mutations happened, and that connection was broken. We went down our own separate evolutionary paths.
Exactly, and we can't forget about the Denisovans.
Oh, right.
Discovered pretty recently, actually, through DNA analysis.
Oh, cool.
They also interbred with Homo sapiens, leaving traces of their DNA in modern populations. You see it especially in Melanesia and Aboriginal Australians.
It's amazing to think about all that mixing going on back then, all that swapping of, genes and stories around the campfire. It really challenges those neat categories we try to put the past in.
I totally agree. It kind of makes you wonder what those stories were like.
Yeah, what were they like?
But it also raises a big question. What actually set Homo sapiens apart from all the others? What launched us on this incredible journey to becoming, the dominant force on Earth?
Yeah, what was it? Was it just that we were, stronger or faster than other human species?
Not really. It was something much more powerful. Harari calls it the cognitive revolution, and it all boils down to our very unique ability to communicate. And he uses this term, finitive language.
Victive language. Okay, so we're not just talking about grunts and signals like other animals, right?
Right. This is about communicating about things that don't actually exist. Things that only exist in our imaginations.
Things that don't exist. So like unicorns.
Well, maybe not unicorns specifically,
Okay.
but you get the idea. Think of things like gods, nations, money, corporations, law, all these things. They're basically imagined realities. They only exist because we all agree that they do.
Whoa, that is mind-blowing. So our ancestors were just making stuff up. But how did that help them survive?
That's the amazing part. Fictive language allowed for cooperation on a huge scale.
Okay.
Instead of just working together with your immediate family or a small band, you could now cooperate with thousands of strangers, all united by this shared myth, this shared story.
Oh, I see. So those stories, those myths, they were like the glue that held these early human societies together.
Precisely. I mean, think about it. Myths allowed us to build cities, empires, these really complex trade networks, things that would have been totally impossible without the ability to believe in and work together around, shared stores.
So you're saying these stories are literally the foundation of human civilization as we know it?
I think Harari makes a very strong argument for that, yeah. And it's not just ancient history either. We're still living in a world built on these shared stories, whether we realize it or not.
Can you give me a real-world example of how this whole fictive language thing actually worked? Like in practice?
Sure. A good example that Harari uses is the Peugeot company.
Peugeot? Like the car company?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, go on, I'm listening.
Imagine you could travel back in time to France, say in the 1890s. You see these machines called cars rolling off an assembly line,
Uh-huh.
and you ask, who made these? Someone says, the Peugeot company. But when you go looking for this company, all you find are factories, cars, and employees. There's no actual tangible company anywhere.
Right, it's just an idea. Everyone agrees on it, but it doesn't physically exist.
Exactly. The company only exists in our collective imagination. But that imagined reality is super powerful because people believe in it, they invest money, work for it, and buy its products.
It's like we bring it to life with our belief.
Yeah.
So from those ancient myths about like gods and spirits to modern corporations, it seems like we humans have always lived in these worlds built on shared stories.
I think that's a great way to put it. And, it's worth taking a moment to think about that. What are the imagined realities that shape your life? Like, what stories do you believe in that influence your decisions and your actions?
That's a great question. So these myths, these imagined realities, they're really powerful, but they're not like set in stone, right? They can change, and when they do, they can totally transform societies.
You're exactly right. And that's one of the most remarkable things about them.
Mm-mm.
They allow human societies to adapt and change way faster than biological evolution ever could.
So we're not just talking about like slow, gradual genetic mutation.
Nope, we're talking about cultural evolution, driven by these myths. It's like our express lane to change. Think about the French Revolution.
Okay, yeah.
For centuries, the French believed in the myth of the divine right of kings.
Oh, right. That the king's power came directly from God.
Exactly. Then, practically overnight, boom, that myth just crumbles and a new one emerges, the sovereignty of the people.
And that shift in belief had massive consequences, right? Like it changed everything.
Absolutely. It changed the entire political and social landscape of France. It sparked a revolution that, overthrew the monarchy and eventually led to democracy, all because of a change in the story they told themselves.
It really shows you the power of those shared myths. Makes you wonder what those early hunter-gatherer societies were like. We tend to romanticize them, don't we? Like they lived in some kind of Eden, peaceful, and in harmony with nature.
Yeah, there's this idea that it was the original affluent society with everyone, just chilling out, enjoying tons of leisure time. And there's some evidence that they had a more varied diet than, say, early farmers, and they probably worked less.
But it wasn't all sunshine and roses, was it?
Well, no. Life was still incredibly tough. Imagine a world with no modern medicine, no supermarkets, no central heating. Every day was a fight to survive.
Okay, so not the Garden of Eden, we might imagine. And what about violence? Was it really a more peaceful way of life?
The evidence is actually mixed. Some archaeological sites show very little evidence of violence, but others, like Jebel Sahaba in Sudan, suggest, frequent warfare. It seems like there was no single hunter-gatherer experience.
Look, like we're trying to understand a totally different culture from a totally different time. We get these little glimpses into their lives through the things they left behind. But their rituals, their beliefs, their specific stories, it's all a bit of a mystery, isn't it?
It really is like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. We can analyze their tools, their bones, but we know so little about their inner lives.
Yeah.
Their hopes, their fears, their dreams. Imagine someone 1,000 years from now trying to figure out 21st century teenagers based only on, their smartphones and video game consoles. They'd miss so much.
That's a great analogy. We can only speculate, really, about the specific stories those ancient hunter-gatherers shared around their fires. But we know they were always on the move, right? Migrating, adapting.
Yes, and those migrations eventually took them out of Africa into every corner of the globe. It's a truly remarkable feat when you think about it.
Yeah, talk about a great leap forward. But those migrations weren't all good news, were they?
No, sadly not. There's this harsh truth. As Homo sapiens spread, other species started to disappear.
What do you mean?
We're talking about the megafauna.
Mega what?
Megafauna. These were the giants of the Ice Age. Mammoths, giant sloths, creatures we can hardly even imagine today.
Oh, wow.
And as Homo sapiens spread, these amazing creatures, they just vanished.
Are you saying we were like the ultimate invasive species?
It's a tough thing to accept, but the evidence, particularly from the Americas, it's hard to ignore.
What kind of evidence? Like bones, footprints?
Well, one really interesting piece of evidence comes from fossilized dung balls.
Dung balls? Really?
Yep. from giant ground sloths specifically. In North America, these dung balls are everywhere before 12,000 BC. Then they suddenly vanish,
Hmm.
right around the time Homo sapiens arrive. Now, yes, there was climate change happening at the same time, but that doesn't fully explain the sudden disappearance of these huge animals.
So you're saying that while it's impossible to say for sure, it seems very likely that we humans had a hand in these extinctions.
I think the evidence points to humans having a big impact through hunting and, changing the landscape.
So yeah, maybe the arrival of Homo sapiens wasn't such good news for everyone else.
It's definitely something to think about. It really makes you wonder about this whole, turning point in our history, the agricultural revolution.
Right, because, I mean, who wouldn't want to trade in that nomadic lifestyle for a comfy farm? Like, predictable food, maybe a nice rocking chair at the porch. Sounds pretty good.
It definitely had its appeal, yeah. Around 9500 to 8500 BC, in places like southeastern Turkey, people started shifting from foraging to farming. Seemed like the ticket to a better life, more secure.
I bet. But there's got to be more to the story.
Oh, there is. Farming, while it did have its benefits, it also came with some pretty profound and often unexpected consequences.
Okay, so let's dig into that a little bit. What were some of those downsides of switching to agriculture?
Well, first off, farming was way more work than foraging, way more.
Oh, yeah.
Instead of, wandering around gathering different kinds of foods, people were tied to the land, toiling day in and day out to grow crops, take care of livestock.
Okay, so much for relaxing under a tree.
Exactly, and their diets got way less diverse.
Oh, right.
They started relying on just a few staple crops, which made them much more vulnerable if those crops failed,
So not all that secure after all.
Not really. And then living so close to animals, close to other people, it created, basically breeding grounds for diseases,
Oh.
which spread super fast through those early farming communities.
So they were working harder, eating a less varied diet, and getting sick more often. That doesn't sound like progress.
It's fascinating, isn't it? We think of the agricultural revolution as this huge step forward, but for a lot of individuals, it actually made life harder, less healthy, more uncertain.
Yeah, makes you think. Was it really progress?
It's a tough question. On the one hand, yeah, agriculture did allow for bigger, more complex societies, led to cities, specialized labor, technologies, but it also brought about new forms of inequality, new hierarchies.
Because somebody had to be in charge of all that extra food and resources, right?
Exactly. That's where the elites come in, accumulating wealth and power while everyone else worked the fields.
Right, right. And speaking of control, it makes me think about the domestication of animals. I mean, we get milk, eggs, wool, all these benefits. But what about the animals? Was it a good deal for them?
It's a really interesting part of human history, and honestly, pretty ethically complicated.
I bet.
The process of domestication basically involved transforming wild animals into, our partners and subjects, but it wasn't always a pretty process.
What do you mean? Can you give me an example of what that actually looked like?
Just imagine the difference between a wild bull roaming free and its domesticated counterpart, hooked up to a plow, forced to work under human control.
It's a pretty big difference.
Huge. To make these animals, docile and obedient, we had to break their natural instincts, disrupt their social bonds. We put them in pens and cages, controlled their breeding, sometimes even resorted to mutilation.
Not exactly the peaceful farm life we picture.
Right. It's important to remember that domestication, while it had its benefits, also came at the expense of their freedom.
Definitely. So we've got agriculture, bigger populations, more complex societies. Sounds like a recipe for information overload, right?
It is, and that's where writing comes in.
Ah, yes, the invention of writing. Time for epic poems, deep philosophical stuff, right?
Not quite. The origins of writing are actually pretty down to earth. It wasn't about poetry or philosophy. It was about accounting.
Really? Accounting?
Yep. As these early cities and kingdoms grew, they needed a way to keep track of all those taxes, all those debts, resources. Imagine trying to run an empire without spreadsheets.
Yeah, good luck with that.
Right. So around 3500 BC, the Sumerians in Mesopotamia, they come up with a system called cuneiform.
Cuneiform.
And they started using it for all the really thrilling things, barley rations, debt payments, that sort of thing.
Okay, maybe not the most exciting literature, but hey, essential for a functioning society, right?
Absolutely. But it also marked this crucial shift in how humans thought, from free association to this need to compartmentalize. Writing, especially for record keeping, makes you organize information in a very linear, systematic way. It's the same kind of thinking that's behind, our modern bureaucracies.
So instead of letting our minds wander all over the place, we started putting things into neat little boxes.
Exactly. And as writing spread, that way of thinking, that need for order and categories, it really started to reshape how we understood the world.
It's amazing how something that began as just a way to track barley rations ended up having such a huge impact on our thinking.
I know, right? It really shows how technology, even seemingly simple technology, can have these ripple effects, not just on our world, but on how we think.
So we've got agriculture, we've got writing, we've got increasingly complex societies. And with all that complexity, I'm guessing we also get social hierarchies.
Unfortunately, yes. As human societies became larger and more divided, social hierarchies based on gender, race, and class became really deeply rooted. And of course, almost every society insisted that their hierarchy, their way of doing things, was the natural order.
But as we've seen, a lot of what we consider natural is really just a story we tell ourselves.
Exactly. These hierarchies are hardly ever based on, objective facts. They're based on stories, on myths that basically justify inequality.
Can you give us some examples of how these myths have played out in history?
Sure, let's take the caste system in India. It's a very rigid social hierarchy that's been around for centuries.
And it's connected to those Hindu beliefs about purity and pollution, right?
Yes, exactly. People in higher castes were seen as inherently pure, while those in lower castes were considered polluted. And that idea of pollution was used to justify all kinds of terrible discrimination.
It really shows how cultural beliefs can get tied up with social structures. And sadly, similar myths have been used to justify other forms of inequality throughout history.
Absolutely. Think about how slavery was justified in the Americas. Europeans used religious and what they called scientific myths to argue that Africans were inherently inferior and therefore destined to be slaves.
They even used the Bible for that.
They did. They claimed Africans were descendants of Ham, Noah's son, who was supposedly cursed with blackness.
Wow. And then there's all that pseudoscience about race and intelligence that was used to dehumanize Africans and justify their exploitation.
It's a dark reminder of how easy it is for us to make up stories to justify our actions, even the most horrific ones.
Makes you wonder about the stories we tell ourselves today. What hierarchies do we accept as normal? What stories shape our ideas about who deserves power and privilege?
Big questions. And speaking of stories, let's talk about another one that shaped human history. A big one, the rise of monotheism.
Right, the belief in one God. How did that change the world?
Well, for a long time, most societies were polytheistic. They believed in many gods. But around the 7th century BC, Judaism emerged. It was the first truly monotheistic religion. And that belief in a single, all-powerful God, often a jealous God, demanding complete loyalty, well, that had huge consequences.
It seems like it would lead to conflict, given that so many cultures had their own gods and beliefs.
And it did. That idea of one true God fueled some serious missionary zeal. It led to the spread of Christianity and Islam, both of which came out of that Jewish tradition. And it also led to a lot of fighting, a lot of religious wars.
Because if your God is the one true God, then all the others must be false, right?
Exactly. And that intolerance, that belief that you have the only truth, well, it's been a recurring theme in the history of monotheism.
So much for peace and harmony.
Right. Monotheism has definitely shaped our world, for better or worse, and its influence is still felt today. But as we get into more recent history, things get even more complicated, and the choices we face, even more profound.
So we've been exploring religion, the rise of monotheism, all that. But those aren't the only stories we've told ourselves about, life, the universe, and everything. What other belief systems have, shaped our world?
Yeah, good point. Alongside those, God-centered narratives, Harari talks about this fascinating category he calls humanist religions. And I really put the focus on, human reason and values, not divine revelation or anything like that.
Humanism, right. I feel like I've heard of that. Wasn't the Renaissance all about humanism? Like celebrating human achievement and stuff?
It definitely was a big part of it. You could consider the Renaissance kind of a precursor to modern humanism, but honestly, humanist beliefs have popped up in lots of different forms throughout history. Harari actually highlights 3 main types: liberal humanism, socialist humanism, and evolutionary humanism.
3 different flavors of humanism. Interesting. What are the, key differences between them?
So all humanists agree that human reason and ethics are super important, but they have different ideas about what humanity really means,
Okay, yeah.
Like liberal humanism sees humanity as existing within each individual. It emphasizes things like individual liberty, rights, freedom of expression, that sort of thing.
So it's all about, personal freedom and being true to yourself.
Exactly. Socialist humanism, though, it sees humanity more as a collective. It emphasizes social justice, equality, and putting the needs of the group above the desires of any one person.
Gotcha. So what about evolutionary humanism? That one sounds a bit more, well, sciencey.
It is. Evolutionary humanism basically sees humanity as a species that's constantly changing, capable of both amazing progress and some pretty terrible decline. It embraces the idea that we can use science and technology to improve ourselves, maybe even to the point of creating, like, superhumans.
So it's like a mix of humanism and Darwinian evolution.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. But as you might imagine, that mix has created some tension.
Yeah, I can see that.
Because a lot of scientific discoveries, especially in genetics and neuroscience, have started to challenge some of those core humanist beliefs about, free will, the inherent value of every human life, stuff like that.
Yeah, if we're just products of our genes and our environment, does that even mean we have free will?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it gets even trickier when you throw bioengineering into the mix. If we can enhance our bodies and minds, who gets access to those enhancements? Does it create a whole new level of inequality?
It's a lot to think about. It seems like even with its focus on reason and progress, humanism is still grappling with some pretty age-old ethical questions.
For sure, and that tension is only going to grow as our knowledge and our technological capabilities keep expanding.
Well, speaking of revolution, let's talk about how science transformed our understanding of the world.
Yeah, definitely. The scientific revolution, which really took off in Europe around the 16th century, was a huge shift in thinking. Instead of relying on tradition or religious teachings, people started prioritizing observation and experimentation. It was all about testing ideas, seeing what actually worked.
That's such a big change from how people had been thinking for centuries.
I know, and it was fueled by this powerful combo of curiosity and ambition. Think of those European explorers sailing off to, like, uncharted waters. They weren't satisfied with just reading about the world. They wanted to see it for themselves, map it, understand it.
And all that curiosity led to some amazing discoveries, but it also went hand in hand with, imperialism.
Unfortunately, yeah, science and empire got pretty intertwined. A lot of those scientific discoveries actually fueled European expansion and control over other parts of the world. New navigational tools helped them explore and conquer. New weapons and technology gave European armies a major advantage.
So it wasn't all just this pure pursuit of knowledge. Science had these practical uses that they often served the interest of power.
That's true, and that complex relationship between science, tech, and power has it's shaped everything. It's shaped the world we live in today.
And that brings us to, the modern world. I don't think anyone can deny that science and tech have led to some amazing advancements. We're living longer. We've got incredible medical breakthroughs. We can communicate across the globe in an instant.
Yeah, there's no doubt we've seen incredible progress. And it's tempting to just think like, hey, things are better than ever. We did it.
Right.
But progress always comes with a cost.
You're right. It's easy to get caught up in all the cool gadgets and forget about the downsides.
Exactly. Like we've been talking about, our impact on the environment is a huge concern. Climate change, habitat loss, species going extinct, those are the shadows lurking behind all that progress.
And even beyond the environment, there are social costs, too. Our constant drive for progress, it creates new anxieties.
You're right. We're flooded with information, constantly pressured to achieve, to buy new things, to upgrade our lives. Makes you wonder, are we actually happier than our ancestors? Or did we just swap one set of problems for another?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's like, no matter how advanced we become, we can't escape those basic human struggles.
And that's one of the things Harari argues in his book. He says that even with all our fancy technology and advancements, we're still essentially those same apes who first walked out of Africa. Our brains haven't totally changed. We still have those same old instincts, those same anxieties.
It really puts things in perspective. So here we are, billions of years after the Big Bang, staring down a future that feels both super exciting and kind of scary at the same time. What do you think the next chapter holds for humanity?
Oh man, who knows? But I think we're stepping into an era of almost unimaginable power, especially when it comes to bioengineering. We're getting close to being able to actually manipulate our own biology in ways we used to only see in sci-fi movies. We could bring back extinct animals, create superhumans, merge with machines, even design totally new life forms. It's mind-blowing.
I know, I can barely wrap my head around it, like woolly mammoths walking the earth again. Crazy. But it brings up some serious ethical questions. Who decides what kind of future we create? Who benefits? Who takes the risks?
Yeah, you're exactly right. Those are the questions we all need to be asking ourselves, right now, before this stuff gets so powerful that it completely changes what it means to be human.
This has been an incredible journey. We've covered, billions of years of history, the rise and fall of empires, the whole shebang. And we've even touched on the future of humanity itself. I don't know about you, but I'm feeling a little overwhelmed, but also kind of inspired. It's amazing to think about how far we've come from those, insignificant apes.
It is an incredible story, and I think understanding our past is so important, especially now as we're heading into this unknown territory of the future. It gives us context, perspective, and hopefully helps us make better choices.
Thanks for taking us on this deep dive. And to all our listeners out there, remember, the future's in our hands. What kind of story will we choose to write?
Make sure to follow and subscribe.